My son was a happy boy. He had just turned 10, he was the light of my entire life. I considered him to be a miracle child. You see, I had trouble getting pregnant. I went through 3 miscarriages. It was so devastating I thought about just giving up on having a child of my own and adopting. So, when I had my son, it was as if God had opened the gates of heaven and sent me a child himself. We named him Finn, after my grandfather. We spoiled him every chance we got. My husband and I had finally made our dream of having a little family come true. We both worked to make ends meet. I was an evening CNA at a local hospital. My husband worked in a factory just outside of town. One fateful summer night would change my life forever. I was running late for work. It was almost 5. I was supposed to be there at 4:30. I hugged Finn goodbye and packed my husband a quick kiss before bolting out the door. I started my nightly routine and was halfway through cleaning patients' rooms when I heard my phone ringing. I rolled my eyes. People knew my work hours and knew I wasn't supposed to be on the phone when working. So I ignored it. They kept calling. I sighed heavily and put my supplies up and headed to the washroom to take the call. Whatever it was, couldn't wait until my break at 9:30. I took out my phone and saw it was my husband. "Hello?" I said in an irritable voice. His panic immediately alarmed me. He was shouting and crying hysterically. My husband is not a hyper man. My husband is what the kids these days call chill. He's the type of guy who would allow our son to eat ice cream for dinner. His panic caused my panic. Is Finn okay? I snapped. Everything he'd said was a blur as the adrenaline rushed through my blood. No, there's been an accident. He heaved. My heart stopped. An accident, I repeated, the word repeating in my head like a broken record. You need to come home, my husband said breathlessly. I ran out the hospital door, shouting an excuse to my supervisor as I jolted past her. My tears were coming down like the first rain in almost a decade. I could barely see as I sped through traffic lights and stop signs. I ignored the honking and angry shouts. I did not have time. I was surprised I didn't get pulled over. I pulled up in our driveway. We lived in a nice 2-story house. Shrubs and bushes were decorative features on the outside. The porch was friendly and welcoming with a mat and plenty of armchairs. The first sign that something was severely wrong was 2 cop cars and an ambulance. The flashing lights and sirens led behind our home. I slammed my car door shut and ran to the backyard. There, my husband was talking to 2 policemen. I quickly approached them. "Brady, what happened to Finn?" I said breathlessly. His eyes were blurred. He went outside while I was in the shower. I guess he got in the pond, and his voice trailed off. My eyes gazed towards the ambulance. 2 EMTs were lifting a small black bag. "No, Finn. I couldn't take this anymore." I pushed past my husband. "You give me my son," I shouted aimlessly. I was about to attack someone when I realized my husband had caught up to me and was restraining me. "No, let me see my son," I screamed angrily as the tears fell uncontrollably. The rest of the evening was a blur. I passed out in my husband's arms. The next few days were the most miserable of my life. My son was gone and I couldn't believe it. I had hugged him hours before. I had made him lunch that day. I had cut his grilled cheese into 4 squares, just as he always liked it. I sat in our bedroom, staring at the wall, mindlessly. Our son was to be cremated. That was the family tradition. It felt wrong. 10 years old. He was supposed to bury me. I wasn't supposed to bury him. I turned my head slowly as my husband entered our room. Neither of us had slept or eaten or even showered. He was on the phone. His hair was greasy and messy. His voice was practically gone from crying so much. What do you mean you think somebody stole my son's body? He hissed into the receiver. I gaped at him. What? Who would do that? How would they do that? He stared at me in horror. He put the woman on speaker. It sounded just as exhausted and flabbergasted, but I did not care. This was her job. I'm terribly sorry, sir. We've searched everywhere, and he's just gone. We think that someone may have broken in last night. Did your son have any enemies? She questioned. He was a 10-year-old child, I said coldly as I grabbed the phone from my husband and hung up. I felt sickened. What did they mean they had lost Finn? How? The police will be stopping by later, my husband said later that day as we sat in silence at the kitchen table. I had a cup of cold, black coffee I was staring at. I nodded slightly to show him I was listening. He sighed. Honey, maybe we should talk, he began wearily. I cut him off with a sharp glance. Don't, was all I could muster. He sighed again, and left the kitchen. I was about to go back to the bedroom, when I heard the doorbell ring. I knew it must have been the police. I decided to let my husband deal with them. After a few moments, I heard my husband's voice. Honey, come in here, please, he said. His voice was unusually anxious and fearful. I rolled my eyes. I was too drained. I didn't want to go over this with the police. I didn't want to keep reliving this. I was in denial. My life had gone from perfect to a nightmare. I stomped into the kitchen, ready to tell the police off. What I saw made me stop dead in my tracks. Standing in the kitchen was my son. His pale blue eyes were no longer blue. They were jet black. His peachy skin was pale and scaly. His hair was matted and wet. His clothes were soaking and covered in moss and algae. I gaped at him in horror. I didn't understand. The smell was putrid, decaying flesh. I wrinkled my nose and willed myself to not be ill. Finn, I stuttered. What I thought was my son smiled, wide. No, he said.